Racial inequality is not just a policy problem. It's rooted in deeply held beliefs about human value that have shaped our institutions, our health systems, and our communities for centuries. Addressing it requires more than new laws or programs. It demands transformation of the narratives and the relationships that sustain it. This conversation explores that transformation and what it looks like in practice, in communities, in institutions, and in the connection between health and justice. In other words, what does it take to build a world grounded in the inherent value of every person? And what becomes possible when we do? Hi everyone, this is One Question, a podcast brought to you by Stanford University's Institute for Advancing Just Societies. On this podcast, we explore big questions about what it takes for us to live together in a world where diversity is a fact of life. My name is Tomas Jimenez. I'm a professor in sociology, and I'm the faculty director of the Institute for Advancing Just Societies, where we drive solutions-focused research and partnership for racial and ethnic justice. And today we are joined by Dr. Gail Christopher, a nationally recognized leader in health equity, racial healing, and social change. She's a visionary architect of the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Framework, and currently serves as executive director of the National Collaborative for Health Equity. Gail, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me, Tomas.
Yeah, so Gail, I want to start with you. We'll get into a lot of the work you've done, but I want to start with what brought you to this work. You have a decades-long career working on issues of health, of racial and ethnic equity, of healing. What brought you to this work?
Thank you for the question, Tomas. I really came of age at the peak of the civil rights movement. And so I think this idea of justice and fairness was embedded, in my consciousness when I went off to college. But personally, my interest, my commitment to health equity was created when I lost my firstborn child. Her name was Ntianu, and she died in infancy at 3 months of age. At the time, I didn't know there was such a thing as, infant mortality disparities in the Black community, or for that matter, maternal mortalities. Although I had lost friends and, the mothers of my friends had died in childbirth. I grew up in an all-Black community in Cleveland, Ohio. But somehow this all came together for me as I moved into my profession and clinical practice. And I just decided that, I wanted to know how could I be sure to have healthy children going forward, and how could I help others to do that?
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. So what did that look like at first, helping others?
For me, it started out in a clinical situation. Patients came to me and I advised them. I worked in partnership with OB-GYNs, OB-GYNs, and much of what was cutting edge then, which was encouraging optimum diets, now it's standard procedure, but, more than 40 years ago, they were still advising mothers to not gain too much weight. And so the idea of making sure that these mothers had everything they needed to give birth to healthy children, that they understood about reducing stress in their lives, working with them on a one-on-one basis is how it began. That soon mushroomed into working with groups and designing social programs that would enable large numbers of people to have access to what they needed to assure health.
Yes, it sounds like the work that you've done more recently on health has deep roots in your own experience and has deep roots in your professional experience. And I want to maybe just fast forward a little bit. And before getting into some of the specific work you do, I want to ask you about kind of a larger framework for thinking about these things. And you and I were on a panel at the Brookings Institution a couple of months ago, and the The only downside of that for me, at least, was that we didn't have a chance to chat more, but we're making up for it now. I really enjoyed being on that panel with you. And one of the things that came across clearly as we were talking on that panel, that comes across clearly in your work, is that you have an idea about not just what's at stake in the work of racial equity, but also who has a stake in this work. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about, not just what's at stake, but who has a stake.
Well, certainly all of us have a stake in overcoming the divides. We all have a stake. By all, I mean the entire country, every one of us. Uh, I believe that the costs associated with health inequities, which are, in my mind, and the literature backs me up on this, are directly related to the social conditions. We call it social determinants. But access to opportunity or exposure to unrelenting stress, they affect the body and they make us more vulnerable to chronic diseases, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, metabolic diseases, inflammatory diseases, infectious diseases, and ultimately mental degeneration in terms of Alzheimer's and dementia. And so there's such a burden, a cost burden that our country bears, which is directly and some might say indirectly related to the fact that we haven't mastered yet this commitment to equitable and equal opportunity for all.
So, Gail, you've talked about social determinants, and we've been talking about this at a kind of population level. But you work with individuals your entire career. What if you can take us inside the case of someone where we see those social determinants of health actually play out?
What comes to mind immediately for me is the work I did in Chicago with residents of the large public housing facilities there. And, these buildings had been designed to segregate communities of color, and they were successful in that. They were segregated and they were also under-resourced as far as the maintenance of the buildings and access to opportunities to get healthy food. Some of the work that I did during that time was to make sure that we took busloads of people to neighboring communities so they could access grocery stores that had a full supply of healthy vegetables and fruits. But there was also too much violence in the community at the time, and so families were exposed to what sociologists term now, unrelenting stress. And stress has a direct impact on cardiovascular systems, on metabolic systems. And so people were living with the, quote, risk factors for chronic disease because they didn't have adequate incomes, adequate protection, adequate access to employment opportunities or adequate access to health care for that matter. The education system was not really supporting the full development and education of the children. So right here in this community, you had thousands of people who were not receiving what our democracy could avail.
Yeah, thank you for that. And one way to think about that is that's what happens to other people. Another way to think about it, which I think is the framework that you've embraced, is that there's no such thing as other people. That we are all part of a fabric. And I wonder if you can unfurl that framework for us a little bit to carry forth the fabric metaphor.
It's some countries in the world, particularly African countries, have this concept of Ubuntu, which is I am because we are. It's very well understood by many indigenous cultures. Uh, and it should be the mantra of democratic nations because we are. And our legacy of a false belief in a hierarchy of human value, which really was foundational to the development of this country, with the annihilation of indigenous communities or the attempted annihilation. Indigenous people are still with us and their numbers are growing, with centuries of enslavement of Africans, with immigration policies that were very racist from the outset. So we have embodied the idea of a false hierarchy of human value. And and as a result, we have developed structures of inequity and inequality. But part of what is the signature of our country, one of the most promising signatures, has been the struggle to overcome that legacy. We are a nation that has grown out of protests, that has grown out of rebellion against what was perceived as unfair and unjust. So we know what it means to stand up and to stand up for and with one another. And that is as much of who we are as the inequities. And so I think that it's built into our DNA to recognize our collective humanity. And the work that I was privileged to do with the W.K. Kellogg Foundation was to design a truth process for our country. Over 45 countries in the world, after conflict and division, have undertaken what was called Truth and Reconciliation. We decided, those of us working on this at the Kellogg Foundation and with over 150 other organizations around the country, that it was a little late for us to simply say truth and reconciliation. We needed to say truth, racial healing, and transformation. And so a framework that tries to encompass all of that work is the basis of what we call TRHT, Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation.
Listen, you anticipated my next question, where I wanted to go next, which is to talk about some of this work. But before we get to that, I just want to say really quickly how much I appreciate the notion that we are a country born out of rebellion and recognizing something that we thought was unjust and doing something for and with each other. And so that's in our DNA, and so is the legacy of racial discrimination and humiliation and subjugation. I think we're just in a time right now where, and maybe always have been a time where there's competing versions of American identity. And those competing versions, I think, are all kind of premised in an either or, that we're either this or we're either that. And if you mention this part of our history or this part of who we are, then you're necessarily excluding some other part. And what I really appreciate is this, which I think this is a hallmark of your work throughout your career, is this really kind of all-encompassing notion of who we are. And so, a recognition that it's not we are this or that, it's we are this and that. So just want to lift that up for a second.
Thank you.
And I think that comes through in the TRHT framework, which I have some familiarity with, but I'd love for you to talk us through that framework.
Well, thank you, Tomas, for reinforcing what I think is the hope of our country, which is that we can be many different things at the same time. The Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation framework consists of 5 core pillars or areas of focus, in addition to 5 steps of action for communities to take. But the first pillar in the conceptual framework is narrative change. We as human beings are really culturally designed and historically programmed to be moved by the stories that we tell, the stories that we believe, the stories that we hear. And in this age where we have such an amazing media infrastructure, unprecedented in our development as a democracy, we can get a lot of stories, right? But
Yeah.
there is a collective narrative about our country that needs to be assertively pushed, which is a narrative that values all people equally and engages the voices, the diverse voices of many people. So the communities and the campuses around the nation that have embraced TRHT, they really focus first on what is the narrative, what is the authentic narrative that reflects the voices of diverse participants in the community. How can we go back and tell stories that were perhaps not told that should have been told? So narrative change is really key. And then from the narrative change, we recognize that we are relational beings. We were designed, I could say, biologically to be in relationship. And the science tells us that the best way to overcome false impressions and biases is through authentic experience, through relationships. And that's what we mean by racial healing. I know the word racial is not popular in some corners today. So I sometimes say we're really talking about the human race, right? We're really talking about our common humanity, uh, our shared human experiences. And when we say racial healing in TRHT, we're really talking about bringing people together uh, in ways that we wouldn't come together because of our segregation. So we work in a deliberate way to bring diverse people together to share stories, common stories of human struggle and human agency. And in those processes, in those experiences, some of the biases and some of the assumptions begin to fall away. So when we can create collective new narratives and we can expand our circles of engagement through intentional outreach and healing, then we have the energy to address the structural manifestations of our history of separation, our history of laws that reinforce racial hierarchy, and our history and contemporary economic systems that deny opportunity to far too many. So you end up with a 5-part framework: narrative change, racial healing, and relationship building, and then overcoming the legacies of separation. Separation is the 4th pillar. The law is the 5th pillar, understanding that our injustices had been embedded through policies and through legal systems designed to do just that, and then through an economy that was built on inequality and oppression of some for the privilege and benefit of others. So those are the 5 pillars of the framework. It is informed by the global truth and reconciliation concept, but it goes further, we think, to make sure we address the structural dynamics.
Yeah, I love the framework, and one of the reasons why I find it so compelling is something you just mentioned a second ago, which is it's not just about, changing the stories we tell about ourselves and each other. It's not kind of just the hearts and minds. It really is about changing systems. A lot of talk about systems change, and I want to get to that in a second. But first, I want to ask you to maybe tell us about an example that when you think about the TRHT framework and when it works and why it works, you point to this specific example as the kind of, exemplar case.
I could point to many. I'll start with Buffalo, New York. Uh, Long before the tragic shooting there, the Community Foundation of Greater Buffalo engaged the economic leaders in this process of truth, racial healing, and transformation. And I loved the way that they made economic transformation their priority, and they used data to inform and engage the business community in ways that were really somewhat innovative in terms of listening to the diverse population groups and seeing where the gaps were. For instance, for Hispanic women to find employment in their community. They involved the local radio station in terms of galvanizing people to be part of this broad effort. And they issued reports of accountability for change and progress. Buffalo, New York is a really beautiful example. Illinois, most of the funding for these coalitions was local in terms of cities. But in Illinois, the state government got involved and issued a grant, a competitive grant process that they called Healing Illinois. And I believe it's in its 4th or 5th year now. And they'd given grants to community groups all over the state to work on bringing diverse communities together. Those are 2 examples, and you may know that we have over 70 college campuses that have established TRHT centers on their campuses as well.
Yeah, though I really appreciate those examples. And, one of the things that we talk about around the Institute is, a theory of change, which is, just a kind of fancy way of describing, what you do and whether and why you think it would work. And I think one theory of change is that you change people's hearts and minds, you change their beliefs, their attitudes, and everything else will flow. And I think another version of a theory of change is you change systems, you change structures, and people's attitudes and opinions will change. I wonder if you can help me grapple with those theories of change, those versions of getting to racial healing.
I really appreciate your bringing out that tension, if you will. There's some advantages to growing older, Tomas. None of them are physical, I'm sure, but
I know that already.
But having been at this for so long, right? One of the things I recognized was a false dichotomy. It's not either or, it's both and. Because you can't, in a democracy, you can't change systems and structures without a majority to stand behind that change and to support that change. And the majority won't support that change if they don't believe in it, if they don't feel that it's in their self-interest to do so. And so that's why the TRHT framework is comprehensive in its design, because it is a both and. Now, in the 10 years that it's been implemented at local levels primarily, we've had a chance to see what needs to be done, what needs to be done differently. I think if you step back and look at where we are now as a country, some of this extremism is in direct response to some of the mistakes that were made, not so much by the TRHT efforts, but by the broader, I would think, racial justice movement, which was too exclusive, or was interpreted as being exclusionary. My interests are more important than your interests. When we can get to a place where we express ourselves as our collective interests, then we have less reaction and less fear. Now, there will always be a faction that will be grounded in the legacy ideologies of hierarchy. but we have ebbed and flowed as a nation in terms of periods where the majority embraced a commitment to fairness and justice. And we're more likely to get to that by calling people into the work rather than calling people out because of their ignorance or their mistakes or their confusion. So we ran into that tension, Tomas, of folks saying, no, we're past relational work. We don't need that. We just need to change the systems. Well, in a democracy, the systems are made up and governed by people. There's no way to get around the people issue if you're going to have sustainable change. And so that's why right at the heart of this work is what we call the healing work, the relationship building work, the bringing people together so that you can build a critical mass of support for what you're doing.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that reflection, and maybe we'll talk a little bit more about the racial justice effort. Some people call it the kind of post George Floyd moment. But I want to ask you what it looks like to actually call people in. Like what, there are people who are well-intentioned. There are people who, their hearts and minds are prone to be in the right place, but getting called in, that can be touchy. That can be difficult, even for the most well-intentioned people. And so, how do you actually get people to come together to do the healing in the first place?
Your questions are wonderful, Tomas.
Oh, I'm glad you think so.
The methodology that I've honed over the decades, which we call RX or prescription racial healing, it and is captured in my book of the same name. But we get a group of the willing, the leaders. It might be 7 people, it might be 10 people, and they make a decision that they want to expand the circles of engagement around the work that they're proposing to do. The work might be a levy to increase the funding for schools. The work might be a water pipe that needs to be repaired. It might be an environmental justice initiative, but they know that they need a broader circle of people in order to make it happen. And so that small core group takes on the responsibility of inviting diverse voices to be part of this racial healing circle experience, which it might be 26 people in a circle, but it could be 10 circles of 26 people. But each circle is facilitated by 2 experienced facilitators who create a web of engagement that is non-threatening, that is designed to honor the humanity of each person in that circle. And it's structured in ways that facilitate each person expressing their stories, initially in pairs or what we call dyads, but they're all responding to the same prompt or the same question. The prompt is designed to elicit human stories of agency, not victimization, but agency. It might be something that says, tell a story about a time in your life when you needed to belong and someone recognized and responded to your need. How did that make you feel, and how did it affect you? So we don't say a time when you were excluded or you didn't belong and leave it there. We say a time when someone responded to your need, and how did that affect you? And so there's something, many of the people who do the work, they use the term magic, and I go, no, 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 you can't say that. It's science, it's not magic. But there is something really special about being in a circle of diverse people and hearing their stories in response to a shared prompt, and somehow getting a window into the common humanity that's present in the room. So these circles are initially, one-on-one dyads, but then the group comes back together and everyone shares, everyone that wants to, and they get feedback from their peers. And so it's a collective affirmation, but it's also a collective window into not just our differences, but our common humanity. Is that helpful, Thomas?
No, that's really helpful. It also strikes me when you mentioned science that the model bears some hallmarks to the contact hypothesis, which is, this social psychological theory about how and why people come together across difference and come to see each other less as members of a particular group and more in terms of their kind of common humanity. And some of those conditions include regular contact. It includes supervision of authority. So if you have like a moderator kind of overseeing things, that people are on equal status, that the rules of engagement are clear, and that they're working towards something cooperatively. And so sometimes, if there's an opportunity to, like, even for a small group, to ask a question of somebody who is not part of the group to bring back, and they have to agree upon that, that's the kind of cooperative activity. And, across all kinds of contexts, all kinds of conditions, they have shown that when you bring people together across racial and ethnic groups, social class groups, et cetera, that it improves the attitudes that people have about one another. And what I hear you saying is that is part and parcel of a larger systems change, is to see that humanity in each other, and that's actually, it's not just something that people go off in a room and do. They have to actually work together to do that. And so this framework seems, and it's effective. It's systematic. It seems replicable across a variety of contexts. Why aren't more people doing this? Why didn't all those years, why are we calling people in and using TRHT then, instead of, calling people out on social media?
A lot of people are doing this work, and it was deliberately designed initially to kind of be under the radar, right? We did hold a press conference when we announced the work in its infancy, and Representative John Lewis was one of the speakers there, the late John Lewis. But we really, once we managed to get a number of foundations to invest in communities to do this work, we just did the work, and we didn't make a lot of noise about it. But thousands of communities annually participate in what we call the National Day of Racial Healing. As I said, we have over 70 college campuses that became engaged and are still engaged in this work. And then we have many local communities at our organization. We take leaders through a 12 or 18-month immersion experience to help them go back into their communities and lead this work. And we support that with individual stipends with funding from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. We had over 200 representatives in Congress sign on to a resolution calling for a national effort, and that was introduced by Congresswoman Barbara Lee and introduced into the Senate by Senator Cory Booker. So a lot has been happening, Tomas. I think some of this extreme resistance that we see now is a result of some of what was happening, not just our work, but those periods that were defined as reckoning, right? So we're moving forward. I'd say to young people today who define themselves young social justice advocates, and they say, we are the resistance. And I say, no, you're not the resistance. What you see happening now is the resistance, you are progress. And I believe we are inevitable progress. But anyway, that's my position.
No, I mean, yeah, you anticipated something else I want to talk about, and which is this moment. And I've been reflecting a lot lately on the word resistance and what that means. Some of the work that we're doing at the Institute is bringing together researchers and practitioners and trying to learn from each other so that we can do work better, more effectively. And right now we're doing a lot of work on cities and what cities can do to ensure that people who are new to the city, international migrants, immigrants, and the longtime residents can thrive together and really create a community where everyone has a stake and sees something of themselves in each other. And I've been thinking about this work, and it is especially the practitioner space where people are doing incredible work on the ground and have been in some cases for years and even decades. And resistance does not capture that work. And I feel like resistance seeds the agenda. It seeds the work to somebody else defining what we do, and all we do is play defense. And so I kind of prefer the word insistence. And it's not just the word, it's the idea that we are insisting on bringing about something, that we are insisting on creating something, the beloved community. We are insisting on creating a world where we, see the mutual humanity, the kind of core essence of each other. And I would rather insist on that than just the notion that we are resisting something else. And so, I'd love to get your reaction to that. And maybe even the context of this moment right now that is challenging a lot of the efforts that you've been engaged in for decades.
Oh, I love that framing. I love insistence. I certainly don't encourage defining this work as resistance. First of all, it puts the focus on what you're resisting, right? And if you're going to be an agent for change, you have to have the focus on what you're creating. And so creating justice, creating fairness, creating the capacity to love one another, to see ourselves in one another, to embrace our shared possibility. This is a wonderful idea, this notion of a diverse democracy, a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-gendered democracy. It's really something. And to be committed to actualizing that potential, that's who we are. That's what we stand for. That's what we fight for. That's what we believe in. And that has to be where our focus is. And so I agree with you 100%. We cannot diminish our power by defining ourselves as the resistance. That's a diminishing, minimizing stance.
And I wonder for you right now, if you think about not just this moment, but what it is that we are trying to bring about. If you do a little bit of take a moment to dream with me a little bit and think about the future a little bit. What are the kinds of things that you are dreaming about? What are the kinds of things that you are wanting to bring about? And if you think 3-5 years from now.
Well, because I am, a practitioner of health, I was licensed and registered as a naturopathic and naturopathic doctor. I want to see less suffering, and I want to see people experience the wholeness that our bodies are designed, to give us, right? The health, the well-being. And I want to see our health care system transformed so that it reflects the population in terms of providers of care. We are still in the single digits when it comes to people of color in the roles of physicians and caretakers. We have a large immigrant population diversifying the nursing population, but it's still not what it needs to be to deliver just and equitable care. So that is still a priority for me, to see our healthcare system transformed in a way that it will bring about the actual outcomes that, we talked about in the beginning of this conversation.
Dr. Gail Christopher, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for all the amazing work that you have done and continue to do to heal our bodies, our minds, and our conscience. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
One Question is brought to you by Stanford's Institute for Advancing Just Societies. Produced by Ethography. Producers Georgia Limcalco and Nicholas Leapins. With music by Caleb Liu. This episode was edited by Declan Franey.